Chapter 14 is all about epidemiology, which I think most students find pretty interesting. I think when we go through this chapter, a lot of the information will seem relevant because of the pandemic, as well as your everyday experiences with infections. This first slide contains a question I'd like you to ponder for a moment. What do you think are the ways that humans acquire their normal flora? Normal flora are your community of microbes, all the bacteria that live on and in us. How do we get them? The choices include our first meals, our first breaths, during the birthing process, and in the womb. What do you think? Would any of these not expose us to organisms? Well, A through C are definitely ways we acquire our first doses of microorganism, but the womb? The uterus should be sterile. During pregnancy, there are no microorganisms there, so this is not correct. This figure over here encompasses what we'll be talking about during this chapter. This chapter is concerned with the chain of infection. Of course, for infections, we need the infectious agent, but where do they come from? There has to be a reservoir for that agent, somewhere that the organism normally exists. The mode of transmission and portal of entry explain how the agent finds its way into the host, and the portal of exit is how the agent exits the host. All of these things are important for the chain of infection. Within this chapter, we'll explore these in more depth. In this table covering symbiotic relationships, it provides an overview of the different types. Symbiosis simply refers to organisms living together, but the relationships can take different forms, just like your relationships with those in your own neighborhood. For one, relationships may take the form of mutualism. Mutualistic relationships are when both organisms are benefiting from the relationship. The organisms are helping each other. For example, the bacteria in our colon are said to be mutualistic. We provide them food and shelter, and some of them provide us vitamins and prevent pathogens from taking up residence. Commensalism indicates that one organism is benefiting from the relationship, but the other is not harmed or helped in any way. The example your book provides for this type of relationship is the mites that live in our hair follicles. The mites are clearly benefiting from the environment of our hair follicles. They have warmth, shelter, a source of nutrition, but they really aren't doing anything for us or against us by existing there. Amensalism is a term I hadn't seen used until this version of the textbook came out. Since it's in the chapter, I guess we should understand the meaning. Amensalism is when one organism is harmed, but the other organism isn't benefiting or harmed by the relationship. There's one organism accidentally harming the other. The book provides an example, but I would argue it isn't accurate. The book describes when a fungus secretes an antibiotic, which is inhibiting nearby bacteria, as amensalistic. Bacteria are clearly harmed, but can you say the fungus does not benefit? No. The fungus is knocking out competition for nutrients. Why else is it secreting the antibiotic? The fungus, in my mind, is definitely benefiting by suppressing the competition. I don't agree with their example, but I really can't think of a better one. I do get the concept. One organism harms another on accident and doesn't benefit from harming them. If you think of an example, especially when it comes to microbiology, share it. Parasitism is familiar, right? Parasites benefit from a relationship while harming the other organism. The disease-causing organisms fall into this category. In this and future chapters, we'll spend quite a bit of time on parasitism and a bit on mutualism, not so much the other types of symbiosis, although we do use the term commensal at times. When we think about our microbiome, these are the organisms that are on our surfaces, but they don't cause disease under normal circumstances. But our microbiota are also living in our gut and all of the surfaces that have contact with the outside environment. I'd like to try to draw this very simple gingerbread-like figure. I'll call it a gingerbread figure to give us an example of where the surface of the person is completely colonized. Don't laugh. My artwork is pretty terrible with this pen stylus. If you think about it, your skin has microorganisms, and so do the mucous membranes of your mouth and your intestines. All the way through the exit, through the anus. All of those surfaces are colonized because they have contact with the outside environment. We are hosting the organisms in there, but all the other internal tissues, organs should be sterile. Our hearts, or deep within the lungs, kidneys, liver, blood, all of those things are sterile. The resident microbiota are mostly mutualistic or commensals. We both benefit, or at least are not harmed in the relationship. The transient microbiota, remember when we did that hand wash experiment, we talked about those? Transients don't really persist. They don't live with us for long. They're picked up, but they don't establish a lasting population, and they disappear. Opportunistic pathogens are important. We'll be talking about some of them through these different chapters, especially towards the end of the book. Opportunistic pathogens are taking advantage of an opportunity to cause infection. Usually, normally, they're not causing a problem, but they will if provided the right situation. One of those situations where opportunistic pathogens can cause a problem might be if our immune system is somehow suppressed. If you think about HIV screwing up your ability to stimulate your immune system, this is the perfect situation for an opportunistic organism to take advantage of the situation. When the immune system is not functioning well, then organisms will cause disease that would normally not do that. Changes in the normal microbiota is another situation that can lead to opportunistic infections. Sometimes women get yeast infections. That's often because they've taken antimicrobials for something else, and they wipe out their normal microbiota in the vagina in the process of trying to cure a different infection. Then that creates an opening for the yeast to multiply to high numbers, and they end up with a yeast infection. Thrush is a yeast infection that occurs in the oral cavity. Usually thrush occurs when there's a local suppression of the immune system or some sort of imbalance in your normal microbial flora. Those types of changes in the microbiota can cause an opportunity for other unwelcome organisms to establish themselves and cause an infection. Additionally, if you introduce normal microbiota into an unusual site, such as one that is typically sterile, like deep tissues of the skin or in a surgical incision, think about the normal skin organisms getting into a surgical wound. When introduced into these sites where they normally are not found, they sometimes can cause a problematic infection. These are times when your normal microbiota might cause an opportunistic infection. Next, let's talk about reservoirs of disease. Reservoirs are where your pathogens exist. The organisms that cause disease are normally found somewhere, and this is the reservoir. If you look over here at the infection elements diagram, let's consider this. You have to have a source of organism. That's the reservoir. Then, of course, you have to have the host for the disease and some mode of transmission from the reservoir. We can have three types of reservoirs. In animal reservoirs, where you would find the infection that could then jump to humans. That's where we talk about zoonoses. Zoonoses has the word zoo in it. Zoos have animals. That can help you remember this term. Zoonoses are infections that jumped from an animal to a host, animal host to a human host to cause disease. They think that did probably happen with COVID-19. When scientists examined the DNA sequence, they realized that this virus is related to coronaviruses that they have isolated from bats. It looks like SARS-CoV-2 virus at some point existed in a bat. At this moment, it's unclear if there was another animal that came in between the bat and the human, but perhaps we'll be able to solve this with more investigation. However, it does appear that the virus recently came from an animal reservoir. When it comes to zoonoses, they can be acquired by direct contact. An example would be rabies, where an animal might bite you, or their saliva comes in contact with an open wound or something like that. That is direct transmission, as is transmission by eating an animal that's infected. Indirect may include when a blood-sucking arthropod, like a tick, feeds on an infected animal and then feeds on a person, thus transmitting the infectious microbe. Oftentimes, humans are a dead-end host for zoonoses. This means that the disease would infect you, but then you would not be able to transmit it yourself. You are a dead end for that pathogen. That's not what's happening with COVID-19 or with HIV. It looks like these viruses jumped from an animal to humans and then spread quite easily amongst the humans. That's not typical of zoonoses. Human carriers are also a possible reservoir. Carriers do not exhibit symptoms, but can pass on the infection. Does this sound familiar? Again, with COVID-19, it appears that some people are transiently infected and asymptomatic, but they can spread the virus. That's a carrier state. We know that there are sometimes diseases where people can shed organisms for long periods of time without showing any symptoms themselves. And this causes problems because they expose many susceptible people to infection. Finally, there's non-living reservoirs like water, food, or soil. Organisms can exist in these places and then get transmitted to an individual to cause infection. Oftentimes, transmission is mediated by a fecal material or urine that's infected individuals or animals that finds its way to food, water, or soil and is ingested by accident. We will discuss this more later in the semester. I was mentioning a minute ago that asymptomatic but infected people are called carriers of disease. Carriers can pass the infection to others even though they're not sick. Typhoid Mary is a classic example of a carrier. Her story is actually quite sad. You should look her up and read more about it. Mary was working in the days before antibiotics. Back then, they really didn't have a deep understanding about disease transmission, but epidemiologists had figured out that diseases could be transmitted by people, and they knew about the carrier state. Typhoid is an infection with a strain of salmonella that can be deadly. Unfortunately, Typhoid Mary was a carrier that worked as a cook. This disease is caused by salmonella, which is transmitted via the fecal-oral route. Obviously, Mary was not the most hygienic of people because she infected the families that she was working with. Mary would get hired as a cook, the family would fall ill, some of them would die. She'd be out of work because the family was sick and members were dying. She'd move on, get hired by another family, and start the process of spreading the infection and death again. She never concluded that she was the one causing the infections. After all, she was well. She never had typhoid. Although epidemiologists tracked her down and told her to stop working as a cook, they had realized the link. She did start working as a laundress for a short period of time, but that didn't pay as well as a cook, so she went back to being a cook, and sure enough, more people got infected and died. The authorities ended up having to arrest her and keep her in lockdown in a group home. She died in that facility because they would not release her. She couldn't be trusted not to work as a cook and infect people. She died never accepting that she was the cause of the infection. She thought it bad luck that employers got ill and an injustice that she was locked up and blamed for the deaths. So her story is clearly a sad one. Why a carrier state exists for some individuals is not really clear, but it definitely exists. I'm going to stop this video lecture and we'll pick up part 2 with exposure to microbes and contamination versus infection.